We've just got some breaking news from Buckingham Palace, folks. This statement has just come in from Buckingham Palace and I'll read it for you. It goes on to say, His Majesty has initiated a formal process to remove the style titles, and for months the palace protected one deeply personal chapter from the world. Then, without ceremony or warning, Princess Catherine finally spoke. Her message was not delivered from a palace balcony or through a formal royal bulletin. It came in her own voice, shaped by the fear of a mother and the relief of someone emerging from a long private ordeal. Prince Louis had been quietly recovering, and the truth behind that journey was more emotional than anyone understood. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Catherine faced the recording device alone and tried to begin with the words advisors had prepared. She stopped. The pages sounded careful and distant, and she knew they could never explain what her family had survived. A royal bulletin, meaning a palace announcement, released in the name of the crown, could confirm facts, but it could not carry a mother's fear. She placed the script aside and began again. Her recorded statement confirmed that Louis had completed the hardest stage of a months-long recovery after complications from a serious respiratory illness. He was returning to lessons, family routines, and the freedom he had missed. That mattered because his absence from private gatherings had unsettled those closest to the household. While changes to Catherine and William's engagements had raised questions no one was ready to answer, Catherine's voice tightened when she remembered the nights when her son could not rest comfortably. Louis had asked when he could run outside, when he could join his siblings, and when everyone would stop watching him with worried eyes. She did not describe every medical detail. She did not need to. The pause between her sentences revealed how close fear had come to defining their home. William had argued for silence until the recovery was secure. The prince believed privacy protected the boy from speculation headlines and the pressure attached to being watched from childhood. Catherine understood that instinct, yet she had begun to fear that secrecy was creating another wound. Their schedules had been rearranged, schooling plans adjusted, and time away from Windsor extended, all while the public received no explanation. Behind closed doors, William listened without interrupting. When Catherine finished, he stepped forward and rested a hand on her shoulder. Neither spoke. The gesture carried what palace language could not: relief, guilt, exhaustion, and agreement. Yet her decision had not begun with advisors or public pressure. Days earlier, Louis had asked one simple question that neither parent could dismiss. Before the family could explain it, they had to confront what his recovery had taken from them all. The announcement belonged to Catherine, but the journey had changed an entire family. William carried the pressure in silence. George tried to appear older than his years. Charlotte noticed every conversation that stopped when she entered a room. And at the centre stood Louis, too young to understand royal protocol, but old enough to recognise fear in the faces around him. Behind the palace walls, each of them had learned a different meaning of courage. Louis had always been the child who filled quiet rooms with questions, laughter, and sudden bursts of energy. His place as the youngest prince meant he carried fewer immediate royal expectations, but he remained deeply important to the family's sense of normal life. That was why his sudden tiredness felt so frightening. The silence at breakfast, the unfinished games, and the days spent resting all warned Catherine that this was not a brief interruption. William fought to keep the household steady. Lessons continued. Family meals remained fixed. George and Charlotte followed familiar routines, even when medical appointments forced sudden changes. The prince believed structure would protect the children from fear, yet normality became harder to maintain each time Louis struggled. One morning, the youngest boy pushed away his breakfast without speaking. William stopped discussing official duties, moved his chair beside him, and asked gently what hurt. Louis pointed toward his chest and whispered that he felt too tired to eat. His father stayed beside him until the plate was removed, but the calm expression he showed the child disappeared the moment he left the room. Catherine carried a different burden. She reassured Charlotte that recovery sometimes moved slowly while hiding how little sleep she had managed herself. The princess could see that her daughter already understood more than anyone had explained. Charlotte noticed every closed door and every lowered voice. She began leaving handwritten jokes beside Louis's bed, because laughter even briefly brought back the brother she recognised. George tried to become stronger for everyone. As the eldest sibling, he believed calmness was expected of him. Yet one night he asked William whether a younger brother could become seriously ill without anyone outside the family knowing. The question struck deeply because the future king realised his son was not asking about palace rules. He was asking whether silence meant danger. Distance quietly formed between the parents. Catherine withheld her darkest fears to protect William. He did the same to protect her. Their love remained firm, but exhaustion turned kindness into guarded silence. Then Louis asked why photographers sometimes waited for the family while nobody had been told he was getting stronger. Catherine froze. His innocent question exposed everything the adults had avoided. Her answer would be shaped by one painful memory. The exact day an ordinary royal obligation became the point of no return. Every royal crisis has a moment that later feels like a warning. For this family, it came during a private rehearsal ahead of a ceremonial weekend. Louis had insisted he felt well enough to participate. Catherine wanted to believe him. William watched more carefully. Then, midway through the morning, the young prince stopped, reached for his mother's hand, and whispered that he could not catch his breath. From that instant, nothing inside their household remained ordinary. Catherine moved before anyone else understood what was happening. She knelt beside Louis, closed both hands around his, and felt how cold his fingers had become despite the warmth of the room. The rehearsal at Windsor had been designed as a gentle return, a private practice before a formal royal appearance. Such a rehearsal allows family members to prepare for a public ceremony without the pressure of crowds or cameras. That morning, however, preparation turned into panic. William shut the door and ordered everyone except the medical team to leave. The prince's fear became action because hesitation could cost precious time. And because George and Charlotte were still nearby, he personally arranged for them to be taken to another part of the residence, refusing to let either child witness their brother struggling. Louis had been recovering from what the family first believed was an ordinary seasonal infection. Catherine had agreed to let him attend because he had begged not to disappoint his siblings. Even before the rehearsal began, she had noticed the tiredness in his face. Now guilt struck hard. The princess kept hearing his frightened whisper as doctors examined him, and she wondered whether hope had made her ignore a warning she should have trusted. By evening, relief had not ended the argument. William insisted that every engagement involving their son be suspended immediately. He believed one missed ceremony mattered far less than allowing the boy's condition to worsen. Catherine agreed about his health but feared that a sudden disappearance from family life would make Louis believe he had failed. Senior aides soon warned that repeated absences would attract questions. An engagement in royal terms is an official duty or public appearance carried out on behalf of the monarchy. The advisors wanted a controlled explanation before speculation filled the silence. William refused. He would not allow his son's recovery to become a public narrative. While the child was still frightened and uncertain, Catherine carried that morning with her for months. When Louis later asked why nobody knew he was getting stronger, she heard the same breathless voice from the rehearsal. The silence no longer felt protective. It felt heavy. So she began writing her own statement before the palace had approved any announcement. When Catherine finally placed those handwritten pages before William, the argument was no longer about publicity. It was about whether protecting Louis now required silence or truth. They had faced public pressure together. But this disagreement was different. There were no advisors in the room, no secretaries arranging careful language, and no institution to absorb the pain. There were only two parents standing on opposite sides of a table, each convinced they were defending the same child. Catherine wanted to speak before silence became another burden Louis had to carry. William feared that one message could expose their son forever. Catherine stood beside the handwritten pages after the children had gone to bed. The palace-approved draft lay beside them, polished and careful. A palace-approved statement is wording cleared by royal advisors before public release, usually designed to protect privacy and avoid confusion. But to her, those sentences felt empty. They described recovery without admitting fear, and they mentioned progress without revealing what the family had endured. William read the opening line and immediately shook his head. The prince said privacy had protected Louis from headlines, strangers, and permanent scrutiny during his most vulnerable months. He reminded her that one public message could be replayed, analysed, and remembered long after their son had moved beyond the illness. Catherine did not retreat. She told him Louis had begun to believe his condition was being hidden because the family felt ashamed. Then she pushed the official draft away. The polished language, she said, contained no trace of the boy they had nearly watched lose confidence in himself. William's restraint finally broke. He asked whether she was prepared to see their child's recovery discussed by people who had never met him. His voice rose, then stopped. The anger came from fear, and both of them knew it. Catherine answered with a harder truth. George and Charlotte had learned to lower their voices whenever Louise's health was mentioned. Their eldest son watched every closed door. Their daughter left jokes beside her brother's bed because she understood that laughter had become part of his recovery. Silence was no longer protecting only one child. It was shaping all three. Louis had also made a request of his own. He wanted to thank the medical professionals who had made him feel safe, and he wanted George and Charlotte to know their help mattered. Most of all, he did not want people to think he had disappeared because he was not brave enough. William sat down. The future king covered his face for a moment and admitted that his decisions had been driven not only by privacy, but by his own terror of losing control. Together, they reached a boundary. Catherine could speak, but she would protect the medical details while acknowledging the seriousness of the journey. Yet one final authority could still stop the message. Catherine had won William's understanding, but her words now had to pass through a monarchy built to control everything spoken in its name. Royal families do not speak only for themselves. Every personal confession can become a constitutional signal, and every silence a source of speculation. Catherine's message, therefore, entered a world of protocols, advisors, and carefully guarded precedent. Yet the final decision did not belong entirely to committees. It reached King Charles as a private family matter wrapped inside an institutional dilemma. What he read forced him to choose between the monarchy's instinct for control and a father's right to speak honestly. Charles received the draft after an evening briefing and dismissed the room before reading it. A royal protocol is the set of formal rules used to manage public statements, duties, and sensitive family matters connected to the crown. Catherine's recording required special care because it concerned a young prince's private health information and months of silence that had already invited questions. The king read the pages twice. When he reached the line about a child mistaking privacy for shame, he removed his glasses and set them down. The words unsettled him because royal duty often teaches restraint, before children understand its cost. Louis had been protected from scrutiny, but that same protection had begun to make him feel hidden. William arrived soon afterward. Charles asked only one question. Did the statement truly serve Louis, or did it merely ease the fear carried by the adults around him? The prince defended Catherine's judgment, yet admitted that once the recording appeared, the family could lose control of the story. Reporters would examine absences, question decisions, and search for details the family had deliberately withheld. Charles understood the danger. He also understood the alternative. Communications officials had prepared a safer version, but it removed Louis's request to thank the people who supported him. The monarch rejected it. A statement stripped of the child's own meaning, he decided would protect the institution while failing the person at its centre. The king gave his approval on one condition. Louis had to hear every word before the recording was released and understand exactly what the public would learn. Catherine read the final version to her son in private. Louis listened with unusual seriousness, then corrected one phrase. He did not want her to say he was merely doing better. He wanted everyone to know he was getting strong again. She changed the sentence immediately. Charles approved the revised wording with a handwritten note. Truth delivered with restraint can protect the crown more honestly than silence. The decision was made, but the moment her recorded words reached the world, the palace would lose the power to decide what happened next. The message lasted only minutes, but its impact was immediate. Catherine spoke calmly, thanked those who had protected Louis, and confirmed that his strength was returning. Then the recording ended, and the family entered a reality they could no longer control. Phones began ringing. Headlines appeared. Messages flooded the palace. Relief spread across the country. But inside the household, William watched one private chapter become public property in real time. Catherine sat beside him as the recording appeared through official royal channels. Those channels are the monarchy's verified platforms for releasing statements directly to the public without relying on outside interpretation. Her message confirmed that Louis had completed the hardest stage of recovery and was gradually returning to lessons, family routines, and ordinary childhood life. She refused to watch the screen. William did not look away. The first responses brought comfort. Parents wrote about waiting beside sick children. Families recognized the impossible balance between protecting privacy and pretending everything remained normal. Their words mattered because the announcement had reached beyond royal curiosity. It had given language to fear many people carried quietly. Then the tone changed. Broadcasters began constructing timelines from Louis's recent absences, placing older family appearances beside Catherine's new statement. One commentator paused footage taken before the illness and began examining the boy's expression. William reached for the remote and switched off the television. The prince said his son's recovery would not become entertainment. Charlotte overheard members of staff discussing the growing attention. She found Catherine and asked whether strangers were now worried about her brother. The princess explained that concern could be kind even when thousands of voices made it feel overwhelming. Her daughter listened, but still asked whether Louis would have to answer them all. George felt something different, relief. He told William that he no longer needed to avoid friends who asked why his brother had missed certain activities. The future king realised silence had placed pressure on the eldest child, too, forcing him to guard information he barely understood. Louis remained practical. He wanted to know whether people had heard the words, "getting strong again." He also asked whether his nurses would understand that he had thanked them. Catherine promised they would. A palace aide soon delivered the warning everyone feared. One phrase from the recording, "The moment we feared recovery had changed direction," had triggered intense speculation. Advisors recommended a second clarification before questions grew louder. Catherine refused, explaining that every frightening detail would violate the privacy they had fought to preserve. William finally understood that success could not be measured by controlling every headline. It would depend on how Louis now felt about being seen. That answer came later, away from advisors and screens, when father and son were left alone with the truth they had both feared. The true turning point did not occur in a briefing room or before a camera. It happened when William found Louis sitting quietly after the announcement, no longer surrounded by doctors, siblings, or protective adults. For months, the prince had believed shielding his son meant carrying every fear alone. But children noticed what parents refused to say. In that private conversation, Louis finally revealed what had frightened him most, and it was not the illness itself. William entered the family's private garden room and found his son waiting in silence. He ignored the chair beside him and sat on the floor, instead bringing himself level with the child. Then the future king asked one simple question. How did Louis feel now that people knew? Louis hesitated before answering. He said he had noticed his father stop discussing royal events whenever he entered the room. A royal engagement, meaning an official appearance or duty carried out on behalf of the monarchy, had once sounded exciting to him. During his recovery, those conversations disappeared. The boy began to believe everyone thought he would never be strong enough to attend one again. William felt the full cost of his silence. He had removed every mention of duty to protect Louis from pressure. Yet that choice had made his son feel excluded from his own future. The prince apologised without excuses. He admitted that the adults had been frightened, and that frightened people sometimes mistook quietness for protection. Louis then revealed something his father had never known. During the most difficult week, he had heard William crying outside his bedroom. The child had pretended to be asleep because he did not know how to comfort him. That confession broke the restraint the future king had carried for months. William pulled his son close and admitted that bravery did not mean never feeling afraid. It meant speaking even when fear made silence easier. Louis held on to him, then made a decision of his own. He wanted to return gradually, not through a grand ceremony, but at a small family engagement where George and Charlotte could remain beside him. That choice changed everything. The family no longer needed to rebuild a royal schedule. They needed to rebuild a child's confidence on his own terms, because forcing a public return too early could turn recovery into another test he feared failing. Catherine entered only after the conversation had ended. She saw William's expression, looked at Louis, and understood that something fundamental had shifted. Together, the parents agreed there would be no statement, no staged appearance, and no pressure until their son personally felt ready. The family had finally found peace with its decision. But beyond Windsor, Catherine's recorded words were already becoming a national symbol of fear recovery and parental honesty. By morning, Catherine's message was no longer simply a royal update. It had become a shared language for parents who had waited beside hospital beds, siblings who had hidden their fear, and children learning that recovery rarely moves in a straight line. The response was immense, but one public moment captured it better than any headline. Outside Windsor Castle, families began leaving handwritten blue stars bearing the same words Louis had chosen. Getting strong again. The stars multiplied along the public barrier. Each carried a message for Louis, or for another child facing a difficult recovery. Windsor Castle, one of the monarchy's main royal residences, had seen celebrations, mourning, and national uncertainty. Now its gates held something quieter. Proof that one family's fear had reached thousands of others. A newspaper placed Catherine's calm expression across its front page beneath the words, "A mother's voice." A smaller line repeated Louis' phrase about becoming strong again. That headline mattered because it did not present him as weak or broken. It presented recovery as courage and placed a mother's honesty above palace spectacle. A national broadcaster opened its evening coverage with families describing nights spent beside sick children. The programme did not begin with royal protocol, meaning the formal customs that shape how the monarchy communicates and behaves. It began with uncertainty, exhaustion, and the fear of not knowing when a child will feel normal again. Some commentators still demanded answers. They questioned why the palace had remained silent, and why earlier absences had not been explained. Officials responded firmly that a child's health was not public property. The family had shared enough to acknowledge the journey without surrendering every private detail. Catherine received a photograph of the blue stars and pressed her fingertips against one message written by another child. She quietly asked that the display be preserved for Louis. Charles welcomed the compassion, but warned advisors not to turn sympathy into a staged appearance. The king understood that exploiting the moment would destroy the very trust the message had created. William read a letter from a father who had also struggled to explain illness to his children. The prince realised their honesty had helped families far beyond Windsor. Louis then chose one star to keep beside his bed. Its message was simple: you were brave even when you were resting. The monarchy answered with restraint. There would be no campaign, no celebratory photographs, and no rushed return. Catherine decided her son's first appearance would remain small, family-centred, and free from ceremonial pressure. The country had answered with compassion, but the final meaning of her decision would be revealed by one last moment inside the family itself. In the end, Catherine's announcement did not transform Louis into a symbol or turn his recovery into a royal spectacle. It did something quieter and more important. It returned ownership of the journey to the child who had lived through it. The family had spent months believing love meant building walls around him. They emerged understanding that protection also required listening honesty and the courage to admit fear. The silence had served its purpose. Then compassion required it to end. Louis made his first return at a small family gathering connected to a children's community project. There was no advanced publicity, no formal speech, and no demand that he perform for the public. A community project is an organised effort designed to support local families or children, and this one allowed him to re-enter royal life without the weight of a major ceremony. Louis paused before going inside. Charlotte took one of his hands, George took the other. Catherine did not urge him forward or hide his hesitation. She waited until her youngest son chose the moment himself. Then the three children crossed the threshold together. William watched them and finally understood that recovery did not mean rebuilding the image that existed before the illness. It meant creating a new sense of safety. The prince had once believed privacy was measured by how much the family withheld. Now he accepted that silence could protect a child physically while still leaving him emotionally alone. Catherine had learned the opposite lesson. Honesty could free Louis from shame, but it could not become an excuse to expose every medical detail. The princess had spoken through a personal recorded statement, because that format allowed her to acknowledge the truth while preserving the boundaries her son still needed. Charles later admitted, during a private family conversation, that the monarchy had not been weakened by the disclosure. The king believed it had gained strength by facing hardship without turning pain into spectacle. His words mattered because the crown had long relied on restraint. Yet this moment proved that dignity and emotional honesty could exist together. Louis completed the gathering without being rushed. When he returned to his parents, he did not ask whether he would ever be allowed to attend again. He asked when he could come back. That question became the final victory. His recovery remained gradual but stable, and the family placed his health confidence and childhood ahead of ceremonial expectations. Catherine's decision had never been rebellion or publicity. It was a mother correcting the message created by fear and giving her son permission to see himself as recovering rather than fragile. The monarchy learned that protection did not always mean hiding every wound. Sometimes silence healed, sometimes truth helped. Wisdom meant knowing the difference. Princess Catherine broke her silence so that Prince Louis would never mistake a private struggle for shame. Louis left between George and Charlotte, walking without being carried, hurried or shielded. The fear no longer controlled them. The difficult chapter was complete.